Hello, folks. I cannot help but come back to this now dormant channel and drop my 2 cents on Napoleon and Julius Caesar and some of the discussions and editorials and questions and things that I've seen online and even in major news sources such as CNN. I saw a couple of weeks ago asking the question, was Napoleon Bonaparte a man of the people, or was he a war-mongering tyrant? Something like that. I've seen a whole bunch of variations of that particular question. A big surge in interest for Napoleon. I'm sure this is due to the movie starring Joaquin Phoenix, which was good. It was all right. I thought there were enough historical inaccuracies that production value was outstanding. Particularly his relationship with Josephine, I think, was wildly misrepresented. However, I'm not here to comment on the movie, but the questions surrounding it. So this is pretty exciting to see so many people become enthusiastic about this kind of thing. Some of the more in-depth historical questions. Was Napoleon Bonaparte a man of the people, or was he a warmongering tyrant? And Julius Caesar has also experienced this extraordinary surge in interest and popularity. Interestingly enough, Oswald Spengler predicted this about 60 or 70, well, I guess it would have been more like 100 years ago, wouldn't it? Or something along those lines. 90 to 100 years ago, Oswald Spengler predicted that there would be a big surge in the future, in a couple generations, he put it, in Julius Caesar, and there certainly has been. So last night I watched the first part of a BBC series, The Making of a Dictator, Julius Caesar. None too impressed. There was just so much superfluous commentary by people. I don't know where they recruited some of these folks. Comparisons to Donald Trump and things like this. Not real impressed. However, it is an expression of this surging interest in Caesar that I think has come on the back of that TikTok phenomenon where women began asking how often the men in their life think of the Roman Empire. And I'm proud to say that far predating this TikTok trend, I have thought about the Roman Empire, or Rome, dating back through the Republic and early years, every day of my life for at least a couple of decades. So, yay me. So it's been interesting to see this, and interesting to see all of this, all the interest that this movie and this TikTok trend have spawned. The videos on Rome put out by kings and generals, even their early videos, have all, as far as I've noticed, somewhere between doubled and tripled in views. That's amazing. So I don't want to bust on these newcomers and say that they're late to the party. I'm really appreciative. I think it's great that people are taking an interest not just in kind of the fun stuff about history, but these more in-depth issues, these more in-depth questions. And the same thing has been asked about Julius Caesar. Was he a man of the people, or was he a warmongering tyrant? Now, if you've gotten this far, you've managed to tune in, you're curious about these questions, fortunately for you, my opinion is the only correct one, and the only opinion that you need on those issues. And it is, first off, that both of these men were warmongering men of the people. That you don't generally hear those two things go together, but that is what they were. Men of the people in a qualified kind of way. They both rose to power on a wave of populist, revolutionary, reform type programs. They were both connected to that. In the case of Caesar, it was the populares. In the case of Napoleon, it was the reformists or the revolutionaries. But in the case of both Caesar and Napoleon, they had a foot in both camps, and they were nowhere near the radical wings of the movements that they expressed. About 10 or 20 years ago, I read something on Napoleon, and he described the similarities between him and Caesar as remarkable. And at the time that I read that, I was pretty skeptical. But since then, studying up, there's quite a few remarkable similarities between the two men. I am often curious when there's a string of military victories by a particular army, how much of that was due to the general in charge, how much of that was due to the army itself. For instance, Alexander the Great inherited his army from his father, who put it together, and all the generals and what have you. But in the case of Napoleon and Caesar, there's no question that their battlefield acumen, their ability to command, was decisive over and over and over again in both cases. No question about that. But yes, so they were similar in that way, extraordinary battlefield commanders, similar in the fact that both were geek-type geniuses, not simply geniuses in being historically impactful or reading the scene politically, but in terms of IQ. These are both men who would have scored 1,600 on their SATs and gone to MIT, that type of thing nowadays. In the case of Napoleon, he was accepted into the most elite military academy in France and then into the artillery path of study, which was the most competitive, and graduated at the top of his class. The guy was, just from an IQ perspective, a genius. Caesar, similarly, was an engineering genius. He wrote the most widely read book of Latin literature and history, De Bello Gallico, still used to this day. An extraordinary piece of literature that he wrote in between battles, just when he, I guess, had some spare time. Both were geniuses who kind of taught themselves through discipline how to be everything else. So they were both kind of like the kid who graduated valedictorian in high school, maybe was a little bit awkward, played one sport as, let's say, the shooting guard on the basketball team or pole vaulter or something that could capitalize on their discipline, as opposed to being just one of these people who everyone was naturally drawn to and naturally liked. Both of these men seem to have been a bit distant in their personal relationships, but learned how to be very seductive, learned how to sway people en masse. Very similar in that way. And yeah, as I said earlier, very similar in their political connections. In the case of Caesar, I think that his, this is just my opinion, his role as the leader of the Optimates is a bit of the Populares is a bit overstated. He had one foot in both camps. He was married to Sulla's granddaughter, Sulla, the guy who we are told tried to kill him, in a story that I don't really believe. He fought under a lot of Optimates generals in Asia Minor and out east. And one of Sulla's nephews was his commander of the right at the Battle of Pharsalus. For that and a lot of other reasons, Caesar was, yes, part of the Populares movement, yes, made alliances with some of the more radical elements, such as Publius Claudius Pulcher, the patrician tribune, and that crowd, just like Napoleon made common cause with some of that. I don't want to get this. I'm afraid of talking. I know less about Napoleon, and I know a lot of things broadly, but I'm afraid to get into the names. I think the Jacobites, I should know this. Similar to Caesar, but both were military men, and both were effective dictators. Both were instituted laws that worked very well. In the case of Caesar, he instituted the laws dealing with the most pressing problem in the Roman Republic at the time, and that was the distribution of proconsulships, governorships into Roman provinces. In early days, Rome was very generous and good to its conquered, newly acquired territories it was trying to incorporate, because it was trying to incorporate them. It was trying to sell them on the idea, yeah, sorry, we killed your father and grandfather, but hey, being Roman is pretty great. Come on board. And by being a relatively generous and soft-handed hegemonic power, soft-handed unless you revolted, unless you went over to the other side, in which case Rome would often burn their cities to the ground and sell everyone into slavery. But it had now become something very different. These governorships were now being handed out among the top families in Rome, and these provinces were being squeezed. They were up in revolt. It was fracturing the entire Roman Empire. Even when Rome was a republic, I want to just point that out, Rome had an empire when it was a republic. Very effective in everything that he did, as was Napoleon, perhaps to a lesser degree. He really revamped the basic social and political institutions of France. Some of that was due to other folks, such as the liquidation of the aristocracy. He didn't have anything to do with that. He was not one of the guillotine guys. And like Caesar, had a foot in both camps. He first became famous, came to national attention by serving King Louis XVI and dispersing a crowd of revolutionaries. After famously saying, or I guess this was afterwards, summarizing it as a whiff of grape shot. So he fired one cannon round into the crowd and boom, they were gone. Also served in both camps, but both men wanted to turn their nations, their countries, into more of a meritocracy and reduce the power of this oligarchic class. In the case of France, France still had something of a medieval oligarchic class below the king, while nations like Great Britain had gone through a couple of hundred years of that point of negotiations and parliaments and the gentry and common people acquiring more rights and challenging the lords, the owners of the lands, the peers of the king. In France, at the time of Napoleon, they were still in that medieval oligarchic structure, similar to Poland in a few respects. And same thing with Caesar. That was Caesar's and his adopted son, Octavian, Augustus. Really took that to the next level as far as liquidating the aristocracy. But that brings me to perhaps the most important part of what I wanted to discuss 10 or 11 minutes in, whatever this is. And what inspired me to make this is when these questions are considered, and this was really the case in the BBC documentary that I saw on Caesar, part 1 last night, is there is a general, people look at these issues incorrectly when they're applying a modern Western liberal democratic mindset to them. And there's a continuum that people of that ilk that have in their head, and I used to be guilty of this as well, where on one end you have an absolute monarch, which is a theoretical impossibility, someone with absolute power over everyone. They can lift their finger, give their command, and thy will be done. There's never really been such a thing. Every monarch in history has had internal forces that they've had to contend with, limits to their power, people who they've had to make happy. Chinese emperors, Egyptian pharaohs might be at the top of the list of the most autocratic, but they had other people they had to deal with. They could not just have anything done that they wanted done. That's how things were. So there's really no such thing. It's a theoretical impossibility. But then on the other end, you have total democracy, and that is absolute happiness and equality, and everyone in the state has an equal amount of power and say-so over what takes place. That is the ultimate good. On the other end, the absolute monarch is the ultimate expression of corruption and oppression. And that is a bad way of looking at things throughout history. That is not. You're going to miss out on a lot. Most of the absolute monarchs in history have, of the stronger monarchs, the people with the greater amount of power, have come to power with a mandate from the people, in an alliance with the people. The most oppressive, worst form of government for the average man and woman throughout history has been oligarchies. For the average person on the street, oligarchies, the rule by a collection of, whatever the case may be, 10 or 20 or what have you, families, lords in the case of Renaissance Europe, these elite senators in the case of Rome. That is the worst kind of government for the man on the street. In fact, in the early days of Rome, when they went through an interregnum period, a period in between the kings, and the Senate was in control, the people were complaining. So now we have 100 kings that we have to listen to instead of one who they could appeal to for justice and relief from taxes and oppressive stuff by the higher members of the aristocracy. And oligarchies are terrible because just as took place in Rome and to a lesser degree was the case in France when Napoleon came to power, oligarchies they're competing with one another, and they're doing it with an idea in mind that one of them is probably going to come out on top and then have to do away with the rest. So their competition amongst one another is brutal and often leads to internal civil wars, such as the case was in France, such as the case was in the War of the Roses in England, such as the case was in Rome for over 100 years, as the oligarchs of Rome, what had been a fairly broad warrior aristocracy at the beginning, the Senate I think it began with 300 people. Rome was now ruled and controlled by fewer and fewer folks. The top, maybe 15 or 20 families. And then these folks, the first probably being Scipio Africanus, you could probably put him as the original military dentist. But then once you get to Marius, and Pompey and Crassus, and then finally, obviously Caesar, Rome was being ruled by men with armies at their command and a spectacular amount of wealth. And even if they weren't consul that year, they were going to determine who the consul was. They had more power than anyone else, and whatever they wanted to happen was probably going to happen. That was the case with Marius. That was the case with Pompey. Now, this is an important part. If you've fallen asleep, this part is important. Those men were great examples. They were able to accomplish great things for the people of Rome because they were less subject to the forces of these competing oligarchs. Not dissimilar to say Henry VIII came to power, well, his father did, but he kind of took the monarchy into a more absolute place. The people loved him and saw him as a savior from the tyranny of the oligarchies. Oligarchies lead to civil war. In oligarchies, there are very calcified social classes. The social strata becomes set in stone because oligarchs, they're competing against one another. They have no interest in raising anyone else up to their level who they have to compete against. Oligarchies tend to invite in outside powers. They make alliances with people outside of their country who are often brought into the civil wars, making them more bloody. Civil wars are just the worst. They're much worse than foreign expeditions, and they're even worse than being invaded because invasions tend to unite people, such as in the First and Second Punic War with Rome. Civil wars bring the economy to a halt. It's terrible. And for some reason, the death tolls in civil wars are just so much higher. Psychologists have speculated on why that is, but they tend to just be so much more brutal. So oligarchies are really the worst. While monarchies can be bad. Dictators, they can do all sorts of things. But throughout history, monarchies with a very strong king have been much better for the common person than these brutal oligarchies. Such was certainly the case in Rome after Caesar, and then you had the Julian-Claudian dynasty. And it was also the case with Napoleon. In both cases, they were able to raise talented men, raise men to positions of high power, just based primarily on their skill and their competence in ways that would not have been possible when this calcified social strata existed under the prior oligarchs. It became more of a meritocracy. And that was something that both Napoleon Bonaparte and Julius Caesar, getting back to them for a moment, were aiming for. That's what they wanted to see in their countries. Something more of a meritocracy. So a monarch or someone in a position of there's enough distance between them and the high tier of the aristocracy. It's going to be to their advantage to raise such people to positions of power, people who are going to be dependent on, and they have nothing else. Their power, their status is entirely due to the king or the emperor or what have you. So they're not going to rebel. They would not have the resources to do it. Monarchs can pick from the smartest and most talented among the other 99% of the people, which is going to give them a much, much bigger pool of applicants for their positions. Cardinal Wolsey under Henry VIII would be an excellent example. All the people under Henry XIV. The Janissaries under the sultans, that would be another great example. They were able to bring people to positions of power who owed everything they had to the king or to the emperor. Agrippa would also be an excellent example, although the lowness of his birth is often greatly over-exaggerated. He was a member, his family was a member of the equestrian class, and a pretty high-ranking or what have you, a more elite family within the equestrian class. Not senatorial class, but another example of upward mobility increases. So there's a cycle to things. And usually in the early days of a monarchy, after the civil wars have been resolved, Louis XIV, the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, King Henry VIII, Julius Caesar, and his heir Augustus, those tend to be very, very good times for the people. Their quality of life improves greatly. And after Caesar and under Augustus, during Caesar, the life of the average Roman all throughout the empire, Roman provincials, Roman citizens, increased perhaps more than at any other period of time for the common people. All those resources that had been spent on wars were now being spent on building projects, new ports, water aquifers, all sorts of stuff. Trade picks up. Napoleon didn't really get to benefit from this because he was kind of at war until the end. But that is an important part of looking at this, is to see some of these commentaries and to think of it, Rome diverted from its democratic institutions. By the end of, before Caesar, let's say, there is no way that you could really call Rome a democracy. Rome was being ruled by these elite families, and sometimes this absolutely powerful person would dominate politics for Rome. And that usually worked out well for the people. That usually worked out better. Marius, Pompey, being that they didn't really have to worry about their the positions, could do all sorts of great things for the people, raise them up. It's kind of an interesting thing and worth considering. So now to the question, were these guys men of the people, or were they warmongering tyrants? Well, as I said at the beginning, they were both warmongering men of the people. Also, a common misunderstanding in the Western mindset on this continuum, if we were to move down to absolute democracy, well, everything is going to get very peaceful. And as we go up to absolute monarchs, well, everything is going to be very warlike because they're totalitarian and war and kill and death. Doesn't work that way. Democratic people institutions have been about the most warlike of any throughout history. You can see this in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. I hope I didn't get that wrong. Athens, despite having many, many times the available manpower, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta because the democracy it had become unhinged. Ask people what they want. It's usually war, and greater brutality against their enemies. That tends to be how people are. The common man. Something else to keep in mind. But they were both warmongering men of the people. And both, I think, can rightly be called warmongers. They were both men who really enjoyed war because they were exceptionally good at it. They preferred life on campaign, both Caesar and Napoleon, and more battles in their case just tended to lead to more battles because they were so impactful that it caused their enemies to coalesce against them often and attack them again. And they just ended up having to expand. One obvious difference is that Napoleon, in the end, lost. He lost in Russia. And then at the Battle of Waterloo, he lost to Wellington. Wellington, by the way, just going back to the effectiveness of Napoleon, claimed that Napoleon's command was worth 40,000 troops on the battlefield. That's amazing. Quite a compliment, too. In the case of Caesar, however, he never lost. He beat everybody. Caesar's life is just, it's you couldn't make it up. It wouldn't be believable as a fictional tale, how he snatched victory from the jaws of defeat over and over and over again. How unbelievably unlikely. If it was 70 BC and you would ask an average Roman on the street, what are the odds of somebody doing what Caesar later did? They would have laughed at you. It was defeated every one of his political opponents up until the end when I think the big mystery, why did he get assassinated more than anything else? Well, he was doing a lot of problematic things, but the big reason was probably appointing Octavian as the guy to oversee the troop buildup in the east for the Parthians, letting everyone know this was now going to be a hereditary thing. And I suspect that's why Brutus scored the last blow by stabbing him in the junk. I think that's the message he was sending there. But up until then, defeated everyone. Lost 2 battles, Dyrrhachium and Gorgovia, kind of, but then regrouped, and in both cases, those were probably his 2 most spectacular battles, the Battle of Alesia after losing at Gorgovia to Vercingetorix, and then the Battle of Pharsalus after previously losing to Pompey at Dyrrhachium. Never lost, unlike Napoleon, whose losses eventually kicked him from power. Napoleon was also less successful politically. Napoleon really lost the support of the people once he started acting like normal European royalty. But that was nothing was betrayed there. I saw Kings and Generals. I was a little disappointed about this. They made a video, didn't Napoleon betray the revolution? Like Caesar, Napoleon had a particular political vision that was relatively similar. They wanted a strong country, more in the direction of a meritocracy. They saw all sorts of internal problems that just needed to be cleaned out. Things needed to be reset, and both were very effective at doing that as monarchs. Both wanted more rights for the people to dilute the power of the upper aristocracy because they both believed that needed to be done. They needed to be kicked down a notch or 2. Things need to be restructured. They're both very good at it. Caesar was outstanding at it. And like everyone else, and this is why these questions bother me, were they really a man of the people? Were they really war-mongering tyrants? They were war-mongering men of the people. I lost my train of thought here. Yeah, so they both rose to power on this populist wave, this reformist wave, but were both not really committed to the more extreme ends of it, which is a good thing. I mean, think of Robespierre, chopping everyone's heads off. That was not the faction that Napoleon was aligned with. Or to think of Publius Claudius Pulcher and the radicals in Rome who burned down the Senate. Caesar made common cause with these folks occasionally, as did Napoleon with the Jacobites, the radical revolutionaries. However, that wasn't their bag. That wasn't what they were looking to do. They were far more moderate. Now, Caesar took an approach. There were, and this has also often been misunderstood, certain political wings within the Populares and Optimates. There was a military wing, you might say, in both camps. And Cicero discussed this. And over time, they both became very, very similar in their policies and what they were advocating. And they were often stealing positions from one another, like Caesar trying to clamp down on abuses in the provinces, which was normally an Optimates position, or Cato famously quadrupling the grain dole, Cato being the ultimate Optimates, taking that away from the Populares. And in fact, Caesar reduced it. He fleshed out corruption. So Caesar was kind of a Populares guy. Napoleon was kind of a radical reformer. He was ambiguous on the issue of a monarchy. And of course, when that became an option for him, it became very pro-monarchy. And so long as the monarch is Napoleon. But both Caesar and Napoleon, like every other dictator, like every other general, like every other politician in history, both had a sense that what they were doing was for the general good, or that was going to be the result of it. That's how people like that work. I mean, the worst people in history, Stalin, Hitler, Vlad the Impaler, whoever else you want to you want to put down there, believe the same thing. As horrific as their acts may seem to us in retrospect, at the time they had it in their head that what they're doing is for the common good, is for the good of the people, so on and so forth. This is also the reality of Napoleon and Julius Caesar. They both believe that very strongly. So framing the question, were they men of the people, were they war-mongering tyrants, it's framing it incorrectly and kind of asked us to imagine what their true inside motivations were. What were their, what did they really want on the inside? Did they really want good for the people? And the answer is, in their own way, yes. And perhaps, managed to create that. Now, look at the case of Rome after Caesar. It was excellent. The plight of the common man in Rome had increased dramatically in the generations after Caesar. With Napoleon, not so much. And I think that's worth considering, to think of, he moved things in a more direction of a republic, gave more power to legislative assemblies, this, that, and the other thing. And I forgot the name of the way that you could now, I don't want to embarrass myself, but the way that you could now move up through the ranks, you and your family. There's a name for that. However, it's worth noting that France after Napoleon was just not in good shape. The 19th century there's a term for it in France, like the sad century or something like that, or the teary-eyed century. France, the birth rate dropped, alcoholism went through the roof. France lost territory to Germany, lost most of its empire. So the life in France after Napoleon was kind of dreary. It didn't seem to have all that much positive long-term effect. I think that has something to do with just how kind of brutal and a bit crazy their revolution was, and how kind of out of bounds of the ordinary. It kind of, I think, shocked France into a way of doing things that kind of reoriented them mentally in a way that just wasn't all that positive. Caesar, on the other hand, his reforms worked. Everything he did worked. Administration in the provinces worked. The laws he passed worked. Everything he touched just made everything better, unless you happen to be an optimatus politician, a guy who, was against him. If you were against Caesar, if you were part of that oligarchy or supporters, things didn't work out too well for you. But everybody else, all the laws you passed, they just worked. They worked great. Now, can they both be called warmongers? Again, back to that issue. Yes. They both liked war. They both sought out opportunities to fight war. What was Caesar doing in Egypt other than banging Cleopatra? Did that really get him anywhere? Even his conquest of Gaul, it was just so extreme. It was, and he kept going because he could, because he could. He looked to make war. He made war against the Britons I guess his casus belli was that they were supplying weaponry and food to the Gauls, their kinsmen on the continent who he was fighting. But same thing with the Germans. He picked fights. He enjoyed warfare, as did Napoleon, because they were both exceptionally good at it. But it's worth pointing out, in both cases, they did not create violence from nothing. There was a lot of tension in building in Europe at the time. They were, a lot of tension building up in Europe. In fact, you could call the Napoleonic Wars the first wars of empire within Europe, because a lot of external resources from their holdings were brought in, manpower, this type of thing. But tensions that had been building up, and there was going to be conflict. And Napoleon, those wars were just an expression of that. Same thing with Caesar and the Gauls. One of the huge problems that Rome was facing now were these extraordinary migrations of Germanic and even Scandinavian people, like the Cimbri migrations, that were such a threat to Rome. It's such an unprecedented thing, but like 100 or 200 or the case of the Helvetii, 300,000 of them said, hey, we're just going to move like 1,000 miles away. We're just going to walk through. And then, of course, on the way, they pick fights. They take and conquer what they can. Caesar stopped 2 of them, both of which were bigger than the Cimbrian invasion that almost brought an end to Rome 60 years prior. Defeated those armies completely. So what he did was not without impetus. And yeah, the Gauls were growing. They were becoming more centralized. And the Romans really had it in their head that eventually their demise was going to come from these scary people up north who seemed to breed like crazy and were big and scary. And Rome had the edge over them only because they were more organized and civilized and could field larger, more structured armies. That was kind of the thought that most Romans had. We're going to get it from these Gauls and Germans eventually. Caesar went up there and just whooped up on them, turned what became France into a Roman province. And Caesar can be credited in a way for creating France. There were the landscape of Western and Central continental Europe at the time. It was more of a continuum between the Gallic Celtic people in the West, and then you had all these blended types in the middle, such as the Belgi. Part Germanic, part Celtic. Their cultures, their language were a blend of the two, and then it became more Germanic as you head farther out east. Well, Caesar marked, he made the Rhine River the boundary, and everything to the west, that's going to be Roman territory, and that's what became France. I mean, more than anything else, certainly more so than Charlemagne, Caesar created France that Napoleon later came to rule. But Caesar was certainly a warmonger. He enjoyed wars. He fought wars whenever he could. He was so fantastically energetic. It was like, oh, we're having a problem there 200 miles away and pretty dangerous. Well, let's pick up all the troops we have and make a beeline there and, fight them. Napoleon was the same way. Outstanding tacticians, just had a natural feel for the battlefield. But back to this question of, what was in their hearts? It's a silly, were they truly men of the people? And I think the answer, certainly the case of Caesar, and Napoleon tried to be. And I think if you're going to use democratic principles as a guide, did he move things in that direction? He certainly did. The long-term effectiveness of that is you can put that in greater question than the legacy of Caesar. But both guys certainly thought they were doing the right thing. Both guys certainly thought, as does everybody, that their view of how things should be is the right way and the way of truth, justice, and the common people will benefit, so on, so forth, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of a moot question. So that's it. I think I'll wrap it up there. I really wouldn't recommend this BBC documentary. It's not all that good. There's just so much. I don't know where they find some of these talking head idiots. And the movie Napoleon. Also, great production value, some interesting parts, historically problematic. There was just too much, I think, editorializing in it. But now you have the answer to those questions as provided by yours truly, Low Value Stud. I hope this was helpful to anyone who happens to come across and listen to this. Thank you.